The words came out of my 7-year-old grandson's mouth like they were nothing. Like they were just Tuesday. "Grandpa sleeps in the garage now," he told his teacher, swinging his backpack onto one shoulder, because Mom says he's too messy for the house. I was standing 8 feet away, half hidden behind a coat rack in the pickup line, and for a second I couldn't feel my own hands. I wasn't messy. I hadn't slept in that garage a single night in my life. But somebody had told my grandson that story enough times that he said it the way children say things that are simply true. I didn't confront anyone that afternoon. I smiled, I waved, I told Toby I was proud of his spelling test. And then I got in my car, sat in the parking lot with the engine off, and made one phone call that would end up unraveling everything my son and his wife had built behind my back. I'm grateful you're here with me for this one. If you want, drop the name of your city or country in the comments before we start. I like knowing where this is landing. And one honest note before we go further: certain names, timelines, and details in this story have been adjusted for privacy and for the sake of telling it clean, but the pattern underneath it, the part that matters, happened. Stay with me. This one gets worse before it gets better. My name is Edwin Marsh. I'm 68 years old, and until 4 months ago, I would have told you my family was the one part of my life I never had to worry about. I spent 34 years as a certified public accountant in a mid-sized firm outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the kind of job where nobody remembers your name at a dinner party but everybody wants your phone number in April. I was good at it. Not brilliant, good. Careful. I noticed decimal points that other people skimmed past. I noticed when numbers that should have matched didn't quite match. My wife, Margaret, used to tease me that I couldn't watch a movie without mentally auditing the character's finances. That man cannot afford that boat, I told her once during some forgettable action film, and she laughed so hard she had to pause it. Margaret died 3 years ago. Ovarian cancer, caught late, gone in 11 months. I won't spend long on this because it isn't the center of the story, but I need you to understand something about the shape of my life afterward. I became a man who ate dinner alone at 5:30 because that had always been our time, who kept her reading glasses on the nightstand because moving them felt like erasing her, who counted the days without meaning to the way I once counted line items. 2 years, 7 months, and some days I still don't let myself finish the number. Our son, Curtis, was 39 when Margaret passed. He'd married 4 years earlier, a woman named Renee, sharp-dressed, quick-talking, the kind of person who could walk into any room and have 3 people laughing within 5 minutes. I liked her, in the beginning. Margaret liked her too, though near the end, in one of our last real conversations, she said something I didn't understand until much later. Curtis married someone who negotiates, she said, propped up in the hospital bed, her voice thin but her eyes sharp as ever. I just don't know yet if she negotiates with people or against them. I didn't ask what she meant. I wish to God I had. Toby was born the year after the wedding. My grandson. The single best thing that happened to this family in a decade that otherwise felt like it was collecting losses. He had Curtis's stubborn chin and Margaret's exact laugh, the one that started as a hiccup and grew into something helpless. After Margaret died, Toby became the reason I got out of bed on the mornings I genuinely didn't want to. Wednesday dinners at my house. Saturday mornings at the park when the weather allowed. I taught him to play chess badly and checkers well. I was, by any measure I could see at the time, a grandfather who was loved. Curtis and Renee had moved into my house, Margaret and my house, the 4-bedroom colonial on Larkspur Lane that we'd paid off after 26 years of mortgage payments, about 8 months after the funeral. It made sense on paper. I was rattling around alone in a house too big for one person. Curtis had lost his job in a corporate restructuring and was between opportunities, as he put it. Renee worked remotely for some marketing firm I never fully understood the function of. Moving in with me, they said, would help everyone. I could use the company. They could save on rent while Curtis got back on his feet. Toby could grow up surrounded by family instead of in some cramped apartment complex with a pool nobody used. I said yes before they finished asking. For the first 2 months, it was good. Genuinely good. Toby's crayon drawings went up on the refrigerator door. Renee cooked meals that were, admittedly, better than anything I'd made myself since Margaret died. Curtis and I watched football on Sunday afternoons the way we had when he was a teenager, before life got complicated and distant the way it does between fathers and sons sometimes, for no single reason anyone can point to. Then, slowly, in ways I can only see clearly now, looking backward, things began to shift. It started with small reassignments of space. My study, which had always held Margaret's old sewing table in the corner and my financial files in a cabinet against the wall, became Curtis's home office because he needed it more, he said, for job applications. I didn't argue. My recliner in the living room got moved to a corner to make room for a reading nook for Toby, which somehow never got used for reading. Small things. The kind of things you let go because making an issue of a chair feels petty when you're trying to keep a household of 4 people functioning. Then came the conversations about my health. It began around the 6-month mark of them living with me. Renee would mention, gently, over dinner, that I seemed tired lately. Curtis would ask, more often than felt natural, whether I'd been getting dizzy. I hadn't been. Not that I noticed. But when 2 people you trust ask you the same question 3 times in a week, you start to wonder if you're missing something about yourself. You've been forgetting things, Dad, Curtis said one evening in March, not unkindly. You left the stove on Tuesday. I didn't remember leaving the stove on. I also didn't remember not leaving it on. That's the trouble with being told you're forgetful. It plants a seed of doubt that grows even in soil where nothing was actually wrong. Maybe you should see Dr. Holloway, Renee suggested. Just to be safe. I went. Dr. Holloway ran a basic panel, said my numbers looked fine for a man my age, and told me stress after losing a spouse can absolutely cause memory fog and fatigue. I took that answer home and let it settle over me like a blanket. Grief does strange things to a mind. I believed that. I still believe it, in general. What I didn't yet understand was that somebody in my own house had a reason to want me to believe it a little too much. By the summer, I noticed the fatigue Renee and Curtis had been describing to me had, in fact, arrived. Real fatigue. Mornings where I woke feeling like I'd run a marathon in my sleep. Afternoons where I'd sit down to read the newspaper and find myself waking up an hour later with the pages still folded to the front section. I told myself it was age. I told myself it was grief, finally catching up with my body the way it eventually catches up with everyone. I want to tell you plainly, I was wrong about the cause, but I wasn't wrong that something was happening to me. Something was. The garage became relevant to this story on a Tuesday in September, though I didn't understand its relevance until the following Thursday, at 3:10 in the afternoon, standing behind a coat rack at Lyndale Elementary School. I'd gone to pick Toby up myself that day because Curtis had a meeting and Renee had a call she couldn't move, 2 phrases I would come to hear so often over the following weeks that they lost all meaning, like a word repeated until it becomes just noise. I got there early. I always got there early for Toby, ever since he was old enough to notice which parents came late and which came first, and I never wanted him standing at that door wondering if anyone was coming. I was near the coat rack inside the front hall, waiting for the bell, half listening to a cluster of parents discussing a bake sale, when I heard Toby's teacher, Ms. Alvarez, crouch down to his level near the classroom door. She was a kind woman, maybe 30, patient in the particular way that people who choose to spend their lives with 7-year-olds have to be patient. Toby, sweetheart, is everything okay at home? You seemed a little sad during art today. And my grandson, in the flat, matter-of-fact way that children report the strangest things as though they were weather, said, Grandpa sleeps in the garage now. Mom says he's too messy for the house. Ms. Alvarez's face did something complicated, a small crease of concern, quickly smoothed over for the child's sake. Oh, she said. Is Grandpa okay out there? Toby shrugged, the universal gesture of a child who has decided a topic isn't interesting enough to think hard about. He has a blanket, he said. Mom says it's temporary. I did not sleep in the garage. I want to be very clear about that, because it's the detail that broke something open in me standing in that hallway. I had slept in my own bedroom, in my own bed, every night of the past 8 months, in the house I had paid for with 34 years of tax season all-nighters and careful decimal points. Nobody had moved me to the garage. Nobody had told me anything about the garage. Which meant my grandson believed something about my own home that was not true, and somebody in that house had told him it was true, and had done so with enough consistency that it had become, for him, simply a fact of family life the way Grandpa likes coffee was a fact of family life. I didn't say anything. I collected Toby, told him his drawing of a dinosaur was excellent, drove him to my house, our house, I still thought of it that way then, and dropped him with Renee, who thanked me with a smile so easy and warm that for one disorienting moment I nearly convinced myself I'd misheard something in that school hallway. I went home to my own room. I closed the door. And I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, the way you sit when your body understands something before your mind has caught up to it. Then I called Denise Calloway. Denise had been Margaret's closest friend since they were both 26 years old and new mothers pushing strollers around the same block. She'd also spent 19 years as a detective with the county sheriff's department before retiring 2 years ago to, in her words, finally sleep past 6 a.m. She'd sat beside me at Margaret's funeral. She'd called me every few weeks since, not out of obligation, I don't think, but because she genuinely worried about the old accountant her best friend had left behind. Edwin, she said when she picked up, her voice immediately alert in the way of someone trained for decades to notice when a call meant something. It's 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday. You never call at 4 in the afternoon. Denise, I said. I need you to tell me if I'm imagining something, or if something is actually wrong in my own house. There was a pause, the particular pause of a person deciding to take you seriously before you've even finished the sentence. Talk to me, she said. I told her everything. The garage comment. The gradual reassignment of my study and my recliner. The fatigue that had crept over me since the spring, the fatigue 2 separate people in my house had predicted before I'd noticed it myself. The way temporary had apparently been the word attached to some arrangement involving my own sleeping quarters that I had never agreed to and did not, as far as I could tell, exist yet. Denise listened without interrupting, the way she used to listen to witness statements, I imagine, back before she retired. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Edwin, she said carefully. I want you to do something for me, and I want you to trust that I have a good reason for asking. Don't confront anyone yet. Not Curtis, not Renee. Not until we know what we're actually looking at. What are we looking at? I don't know yet, she said. That's exactly the problem. But a 7-year-old doesn't invent a detail like the garage is temporary out of nowhere. Somebody built that sentence for him to repeat. And people don't build sentences like that unless they're preparing the ground for something. Preparing the ground. The phrase stuck in my chest like a swallowed stone. What do I do? I asked. Tonight, nothing, she said. Tomorrow, you're going to tell your son you're going out of town. A conference, a old college friend, anything ordinary. And then you're going to let me help you find out what's actually happening in that house when you're supposedly not there to see it. I didn't sleep that night, not in the garage, not anywhere. I lay in my own bed in my own house, staring at the ceiling, running back through 8 months of small moments I'd let pass without weight. The stove I supposedly left on. The dizziness I supposedly reported and didn't remember reporting. The word temporary attached to an arrangement that hadn't happened yet. 40 years of checking other people's numbers had taught me one unbending rule: when a pattern shows up too many times to be coincidence, it isn't coincidence. It's a system. And I had just discovered, standing behind a coat rack at my grandson's school, that I might be living inside somebody else's system without ever having agreed to join it. Friday morning, I told Curtis I was driving up to see an old fraternity brother in Scranton for the weekend, a man named Walt Higgins who existed, and who I did in fact call afterward to make sure he'd back the story if anyone asked, though nobody ever did. Curtis barely looked up from his laptop. "Sounds good, Dad," he said. "Drive safe." Renee, pouring coffee at the counter, added, "We'll hold down the fort." I nodded, picked up an overnight bag I'd packed the night before with 2 days of clothes I had no intention of wearing anywhere but a motel 11 miles from my own house, and drove away from Larkspur Lane at 8:40 that morning with my hands steadier on the wheel than I expected them to be. Denise met me at a diner off Route 22 with a man I hadn't met before, a mid-50s, quiet, dressed like he could disappear into any hardware store in America. "This is Sal Reyes," she said. "Private investigator. Used to work fraud cases with the department before he went independent. He's the best there is at exactly the kind of thing you're describing." Sal shook my hand with a brief, appraising grip of someone who'd shaken a lot of hands belonging to a lot of frightened people. "Detective Calloway gave me the broad strokes," he said. "I want to hear it from you. Everything. Even the parts that feel too small to matter." So I told him. All of it, the same way I'd told Denise, except this time I told it slower, and Sal wrote in a small notebook the whole time, occasionally asking a question that made me realize I'd skipped over something important without meaning to. "The fatigue," he said. "When did it start exactly?" "Late spring. April, maybe. And that's around when they started asking about your health?" "A little before, actually. March." He wrote that down and underlined it. "They predicted the symptom before you had it," he said quietly. "That's not concern, Mr. Marsh. That's planning." I felt something cold settle into my stomach hearing it put that plainly. "Here's what we're going to do," Sal said. "With your permission, I'm going to install cameras in your house today, while your son and daughter-in-law believe you're in Scranton. Living room, kitchen, hallway, and if you're comfortable with it, your own bedroom, not intrusive angles, just enough to see who comes and goes and what happens when they believe no one is watching. Everything's fully legal in Pennsylvania as long as it's your own property and there's no audio in areas where privacy is reasonably expected, so we'll keep the bedroom camera to motion and door activity only. You'll have access to everything in real time." "And if there's nothing there?" I asked. "If I'm just an old fool who misheard his grandson?" Sal closed his notebook. "Then you'll have spent a few $100s proving your family loves you exactly as much as you think they do," he said. "That's not the worst outcome in the world, Mr. Marsh. But I don't think that's what we're going to find." He installed 5 cameras that afternoon while the house sat empty, Curtis at some appointment he hadn't specified, Renee out with Toby at what she'd called a playdate. A camera in the smoke detector housing above the living room. One tucked into a decorative clock on the kitchen wall. One behind a picture frame in the front hallway. one in the bookshelf of what used to be my study, and one, motion-activated only, mounted discreetly near the ceiling molding in my own bedroom, aimed at the door and the nightstand, nothing more. I checked into the roadside motel 11 miles out that evening, laptop open on a bedspread that smelled faintly of bleach, and for the first time in 8 months, I watched my own house from the outside. Friday evening, nothing unusual. Curtis came home at 6:15. Renee had dinner going. Toby did homework at the kitchen table while cartoons played faintly in the background. It looked, from the camera's flat, unblinking angle, exactly like the family I thought I had. Saturday was different. At 11:20 in the morning, Renee sat down at the kitchen table with her laptop and a stack of papers I recognized immediately, even from the awkward angle of the clock camera, as bank statements. Mine. I knew the particular pale blue of Meridian Trust's letterhead the way you know your own handwriting. Curtis joined her a few minutes later, coffee in hand, and sat across from her. "How much is actually liquid?" he asked, low enough that I had to lean toward my laptop speaker to catch it. "About 410 in the money market, plus the house is worth 680, maybe 7 if the market holds through spring," Renee said, flipping a page. "Life insurance from when your mother passed rolled into an account he never touches. Another 190 there." Curtis exhaled slowly. "And Holloway's on board?" "Holloway does what my brother tells him to do," Renee said, not looking up from the papers. "He'll write whatever cognitive assessment we need whenever we need it. That's what $4,000 a year buys you, Curtis. It buys you a doctor who signs things." I sat on that motel bedspread and felt something in my chest crack quietly down the middle. Dr. Holloway, my doctor, the one who told me my numbers looked fine, the one I trusted with my own body, was, apparently, Renee's brother's business, or something close enough to it that $4,000 a year bought his signature. "We need the fatigue to be documented independently," Renee continued. "Not just Holloway's notes. If Curtis's father's own doctor is the only one saying he's declining, a good lawyer picks that apart in about 10 minutes. We need a second source. A neutral one, on paper." "Like what?" "Like a police welfare check," Renee said, and I heard, even through a laptop speaker 11 miles away, the small satisfied edge in her voice of someone explaining a plan she was proud of. An officer shows up because a concerned party, a teacher, a neighbor, anyone outside the family, reports an elderly man seeming confused and disoriented. The officer writes an incident report. That report becomes independent documentation. That's worth 10 times anything Holloway signs. I understood, listening to that sentence, exactly why my grandson had been told a story about a garage. Toby wasn't being punished. Toby was being used. A 7-year-old repeating a strange detail to his teacher, a detail specific enough to trigger a concerned adult into calling someone, was cheaper and cleaner than any forged document. Children don't lie convincingly on purpose. They lie perfectly by accident when they believe what they've been told. "He's already dizzy some mornings," Curtis said. "The dosage." "Keep it exactly where it is," Renee cut in. "Too much too fast and it shows up in a blood panel if anyone ever orders the right test. Slow is safer. We have time. Holloway's not going anywhere, and neither is your father, not until we're ready." I stopped the recording there, not because the software stopped, but because I had to stop listening for a moment, hands pressed flat against my own knees, breathing the way Dr. Holloway himself, of all people, had once taught me to breathe during a health scare years earlier that I now understood might have been the first small test run of whatever this was. Dosage. My own son had said the word dosage about his own father, and the woman across the table from him had answered like a project manager discussing a timeline. I called Sal that night. He answered on the second ring. "I need you to hear something," I said, and I played him the recording over the phone, my hand shaking slightly against the receiver. When it finished, Sal was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Marsh," he said finally, "I've done this work for 11 years. That is one of the most explicit planning conversations I've ever heard captured on a residential system. Dosage. Documentation. A cognitive assessment they can produce on demand. This isn't a family under financial stress cutting corners. This is a structured plan with a timeline. What do I do?" "Tomorrow, nothing changes on your end," Sal said. "You stay in Scranton, as far as they know. I'm going to start pulling records, Dr. Holloway's licensing history, any complaints filed against him, financial connections between his practice and Renee's family. I want to know exactly how deep this goes before we move. And Mr. Marsh, I think you need a lawyer who specializes in elder financial abuse, not just a general practice attorney. I know exactly who to call." Her name was Ben Okafor, a soft-spoken man in his early 50s who'd built his entire practice around exactly this kind of case: adult children, forged authority, quiet financial extraction from parents too trusting or too isolated to notice. I met him Monday morning in a conference room above a print shop in downtown Harrisburg, Denise and Sal both present, my laptop open on the table between us with 3 days of footage backed up to 2 separate cloud accounts. Ben listened to the recording twice, taking notes both times, his expression unreadable in the particular way I imagine lawyers train themselves to hold. "Mr. Marsh," he said when he finished, "what you're describing has 3 separate strands, and I want to walk through each of them, because they carry different legal weight and we'll need different evidence for each." He held up one finger. "First, potential medical fraud and elder endangerment, if Dr. Holloway is knowingly falsifying assessments or if he's involved in administering something to affect your cognition. That's serious, potentially criminal, depending on what we can prove." A second finger. "Second, they're clearly building toward some kind of legal incapacity finding, a guardianship or conservatorship petition, most likely, so they can gain control of your finances and property without your consent. If they already have documents drafted, we need to find them before they're filed." A third finger. "And third, and this is the one that concerns me most as a father myself, Mr. Marsh, they used your grandson. Whether or not Toby understands what is part of, an adult coached that child to repeat a specific, damaging detail to a mandated reporter, his teacher, in order to manufacture a paper trail. That's manipulation of a minor in service of fraud. It complicates everything, and it means we need to move carefully so Toby isn't hurt any more than he already has been." I hadn't let myself think fully about that third point since the moment I'd heard it in the school hallway. Hearing Ben name it directly, manipulation of a minor, made something in me go rigid with an anger cleaner and colder than anything I'd felt yet. "What do we do about Dr. Holloway?" I asked. "We start there," Ben said. "If he's been falsifying medical assessments, that's the piece most likely to leave a paper trail outside your household: prescription records, lab orders, billing codes. Sal, can you pull his licensing board history?" "Already started," Sal said. "Give me 2 days." It took Sal 1 day and 11 hours. Dr. Gerald Holloway had been licensed in Pennsylvania for 22 years, a general practitioner with an unremarkable record until 18 months earlier, when a formal complaint had been filed against him by the adult daughter of a different elderly patient, alleging he'd diagnosed her mother with early dementia despite normal cognitive test results, in order to support a guardianship petition filed by her brother. The complaint had been dismissed for insufficient evidence. But it existed, on paper, a matter of public record if you knew where to look. "There's more," Sal said, sliding a folder across Ben's conference table 2 days later. Halloway's practice has an unusual billing arrangement with a company called Ridgeline Family Consulting, LLC. Ridgeline is registered to a man named Marcus Bell. Marcus Bell is Renee's older brother. Renee's brother. Not a friend, not a business associate, family, the same way Curtis was my family, using a medical license the way you'd use a wrench, as a tool for a specific job. Ridgeline has paid Halloway's practice consulting fees for times in the past 14 months, Sal continued. $4,800 each time. The pattern lines up with billing dates for cognitive assessments on at least 2 other elderly patients, both of whom, according to public county filings, are now under guardianship arrangements managed by relatives. 2 other victims, I said quietly. At least 2 we can currently document, Sal said. There may be more. This looks less like a one-time scheme against you specifically, Mr. Marsh, and more like a business model. Your daughter-in-law's family appears to have built something closer to an operation. I sat with that for a long moment, the folder open in front of me, 2 strangers' names on 2 documents representing 2 families I would never meet who had apparently already lost what I was still, barely, in time to save. We need those 2 families, Ben said. If we can establish a documented pattern, this stops being a private family dispute we settle quietly. It becomes something a district attorney takes seriously. Sal, can you find them? Working on it, Sal said. While Sal worked on tracing the 2 prior cases, Ben filed, discreetly and without alerting Curtis or Renee, an emergency motion with the county court requesting that no guardianship or conservatorship petition regarding me be granted without an independent judicial hearing and an independent medical evaluation performed by a physician of the court's choosing rather than mine. It was a quiet, technical, unglamorous filing. It was also, Ben told me, the single most important piece of paper in the entire case, because it meant that whenever Curtis and Renee finally moved to file whatever they'd been building toward, the system would already be primed to stop and look closely rather than rubber stamp it through. They think they're operating in silence, Ben said. As of this filing, they're not. They just don't know it yet. I returned home Sunday evening, as scheduled, my overnight bag over my shoulder, my face arranged into the tired, mildly foggy expression I had apparently been performing for months without meaning to and now performed on purpose. Curtis hugged me at the door. Good trip? He asked. Good trip, I said. Walt's knees are worse than mine. Renee handed me a cup of tea when I sat down, the same brand she'd been serving me for months, and for the first time I looked at that cup with a kind of clinical suspicion I'd never applied to anything in my own kitchen before. I drank it anyway. Sal had advised me, the way Dr. Owens had advised another man in another story I'd later learn had happened to someone else entirely, to change nothing about my visible behavior. Panic accelerates people. Normalcy buys time. But that night, alone in my bedroom, I did something I hadn't done in 8 months. I opened the drawer in my nightstand where I kept my evening pills, a mild blood pressure medication Dr. Halloway had prescribed the year before, 1 small white tablet a night, and I didn't take it. I set it aside in a folded tissue instead, the way, I would later learn, another frightened man in another house had once done with a glass of orange juice. I did this every night for the following 9 days, quietly collecting 9 small white tablets in a sealed sandwich bag hidden inside a rolled sock in my sock drawer, a hiding place so unremarkable I nearly laughed at myself for choosing it. On the 10th day, I drove myself, alone, to an independent lab 2 towns over that Sal had recommended specifically because it had no billing relationship with anyone in Renee's family and no referral connection to Dr. Halloway's practice. A technologist named Priya Nandakumar took the sealed bag from me without asking many questions, logged it under a private testing code rather than through my insurance, and told me results would take 4 to 6 business days. They took 5. I sat across from Priya in a small consultation room on a Thursday afternoon, and she slid a printed report across the table, one line highlighted near the top. "Your medication has been substituted," she said quietly. "This isn't your blood pressure prescription. What we found in these tablets is a compound called clonazepam, a sedative, pressed into capsules made to visually match your existing prescription. At the dosage indicated, taken nightly over an extended period, this would produce exactly the symptoms you described: persistent fatigue, morning grogginess, short-term memory disruption, difficulty concentrating. It would also, over time, present to an outside observer, or to a physician predisposed to find it, as the early signs of cognitive decline." I stared at the highlighted line. Clonazepam. Not my medication. Not anything Dr. Holloway had told me he was prescribing. Somebody had opened bottles in my own house and refilled them with something else entirely, patiently, month after month, while calling it care. "I want to be clear about something, Mr. Marsh," Priya said, her voice gentle but direct. "This isn't a mistake a pharmacy makes. This is deliberate substitution, done by someone with access to your medication and enough basic knowledge to choose a compound that would produce symptoms consistent with what you'd already been told to expect from aging and grief. Whoever did this understood exactly what story they wanted your body to tell." I thanked her, took the report, folded it into my jacket the way you fold something you cannot afford to lose, and drove straight to Ben's office. Ben read the toxicology report twice, the same way he'd listened to the recording twice, and set it down carefully on the conference table. "Mr. Marsh," he said, "this changes everything. Under Pennsylvania law, knowingly administering a substance to another person without their knowledge or consent, with intent to cause physical or cognitive impairment, is a felony. Combined with what we already have, the recording, the financial planning documents, the connection to Dr. Holloway's fraudulent assessments, this is no longer primarily a civil matter about guardianship. This is criminal conspiracy, elder abuse, and likely fraud, and I believe it's time to bring in law enforcement formally rather than continuing to build this quietly on our own." Denise, sitting at the end of the table in her retired detective posture that never quite left her no matter how many years passed since her badge, nodded slowly. "I can make the introduction," she said. "There's a detective in financial crimes I trust completely. Her name is Maribel Cho. She's handled 2 elder fraud cases in the past year alone. I'll call her tonight." Detective Cho met with us 2 days later in a windowless room at the county sheriff's department, a woman in her early 40s with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to let silence do work that questions sometimes can't. She listened to the recording. She read Priya's toxicology report. She reviewed Sal's documentation of Ridgeline Family Consulting and its financial ties to Dr. Holloway's practice. "Mr. Marsh," she said finally, "I want to tell you plainly that what you've brought me is more complete and more damning than 90% of what walks through this door. But I also want to tell you what we still need before we can move to arrest with confidence rather than hope. We need to identify the other 2 families you believe were affected by this same arrangement. We need a recorded conversation where either your son, your daughter-in-law, or Dr. Holloway explicitly acknowledges what they've done, in terms specific enough that a jury cannot mistake it for confusion or coincidence. And ideally, we need to catch the moment they attempt to move on the actual asset, the guardianship filing, or an attempt to transfer or sell property, because intent alone convinces some juries, but intent paired with an overt act convinces all of them. How do we get that?" I asked. Detective Cho looked at Ben, and something passed between them, the shorthand of 2 professionals who had clearly worked cases like this together before. "We let them think they're winning," she said. "Mr. Marsh, are you willing to keep living exactly as you have been for a little while longer, knowing everything you now know? It will not be easy. It may be the hardest thing you do in this entire process. I thought about my grandson, 7 years old, telling his teacher a garage story built for him by adults who loved their own plan more than they loved him. I thought about 2 other families, names I didn't yet know, who had already lost what I still had a chance to protect. "Yes," I said. "Tell me what to do." Sal found the 2 prior families within another week. The first was a woman named Corinne Ashby, 81 years old, whose son had gained conservatorship over her estate 14 months earlier following a cognitive assessment from Dr. Halloway. She'd lost her home in Chambersburg to a forced sale 6 months later and now lived in an assisted care facility her son had selected, on a monthly allowance her son controlled. When Sal reached her, gently, through a caseworker at the facility, she agreed to speak with Detective Cho, though her voice, Sal told me afterward, had the flat, resigned quality of someone who had stopped expecting anyone to believe her a long time ago. The second family took longer to locate because the victim, a man named Theodore Whitlock, had passed away for months after losing guardianship of his own affairs, heart failure, according to the death certificate, though his daughter, once contacted, told Detective Cho she had never believed the timeline was coincidental, given how rapidly her father's health had declined after control of his medication had shifted to her brother. 2 documented patterns. 1 possible additional death. Detective Cho's face, when she reviewed the connecting details, lost whatever professional neutrality it had carried up to that point. "This is a pattern crime," she said. "Not a family dispute that went too far. A pattern. And Mr. Marsh, I need to say this directly, if your son and daughter-in-law are willing to do this to their own father, and if this connects to at least 1 other death that was never properly investigated, then the timeline for your own situation may be more urgent than any of us initially assumed." We moved to close it out on a Sunday, 6 weeks after I'd stood behind that coat rack at Lindale Elementary and heard my grandson describe a garage I had never slept in. The plan, built over 3 meetings between Ben, Detective Cho, and Sal, was straightforward in structure and excruciating in practice. I would tell Curtis and Renee I'd been thinking things over, that I understood I was getting older, that maybe it was time to discuss the paperwork they'd occasionally mentioned in passing, always vaguely, always as something for someday. I would invite them, along with Dr. Halloway, whom I would ask to join us under the pretense of wanting his professional opinion in the room, to a family dinner at the house on a Sunday evening. What Curtis and Renee wouldn't know was that Detective Cho and a second plainclothes officer would be positioned 2 houses down in an unmarked vehicle. That a small recording device, legally installed with my consent as the homeowner, would capture everything said in my own living room. That Denise would be present as a guest, introduced simply as an old family friend. That Ben would arrive separately, invited as my personal attorney to help me understand my own affairs, a phrase that would sound, I hoped, exactly weak and confused enough to invite them to speak freely. I sent the invitation Thursday morning. Curtis replied within the hour, "Of course, Dad. Whatever you need. We'll be there." Dr. Halloway's office confirmed his attendance by Friday afternoon. Sunday arrived cold and clear, the kind of late autumn day where the light comes in low and gold through the front windows in the exact way it always had when Margaret was alive and this house was simply our house, before it became a stage for something none of us had chosen except the people who built it. I set the table with the good china, Margaret's wedding china, used perhaps a dozen times in 30 years, saved for occasions we always assumed would be happier than this one. I placed her photograph on the sideboard, not as a message to anyone else in the room, but because I wanted her there. I wanted, at some level I couldn't fully explain, for her to be present for whatever was about to happen in the house we'd built together. Denise arrived first, at 5:40, in a cardigan rather than anything resembling a badge, and hugged me at the door the way an old family friend would. Ben arrived at 5:50, carrying a slim leather folder, greeting Curtis and Renee with the mild, unthreatening warmth of a man who had, as far as they knew, simply been asked to help an aging client organize his finances. Dr. Holloway arrived at 6 o'clock exactly, in a grey suit, carrying nothing, his hand shake at the door firm and practiced in the particular way of a man accustomed to reassuring frightened patients. Toby was at a friend's house for the evening, Renee's arrangement, made without my asking, though I understood exactly why once dinner began. Whatever they expected to happen that night, they hadn't wanted their son present for it. We sat at 6:30. Curtis carved the roast. Renee passed the vegetables with the easy, practiced hospitality she'd shown me for 8 months. Dr. Holloway asked polite questions about my health, and I answered them the way a tired old man answers, softly, a little vaguely, letting my voice trail at the ends of sentences the way I had, apparently, been trailing off for months without meaning to. At 7:15, I set down my fork. "I want to talk about the future," I said, and the room went very slightly, almost imperceptibly, still. "I know you've all been worried about me. I know things have been harder since Margaret passed than I've let on. I think it might be time to look at some paperwork. Ben's here to help me understand my options." Curtis's face relaxed into something close to relief. Renee reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, her expression arranged into warm concern. "Dad, we're just glad you're finally ready to talk about this," she said. "We've only ever wanted to help." "I know," I said. "I know you have. I just want to understand things clearly first. Ben, would you walk us through what a guardianship arrangement would actually look like?" Ben opened his folder, calm and unhurried, and began speaking in the measured, technical language of a man walking a family through an unremarkable legal process, the kind of language, I understood even as I heard it, designed specifically to make Curtis, Renee, and Dr. Holloway believe they had already won. It was Dr. Holloway who made the first mistake. Given Edwin's cognitive assessment from 3 months ago, he said, addressing Ben directly, "Professional and confident, I think a full conservatorship is medically appropriate at this stage. The decline has been documented and consistent." "Can you describe that decline for me?" Ben asked, his pen poised over a legal pad, his voice carrying nothing but polite professional curiosity. "Progressive fatigue, short-term memory lapses, disorientation," Dr. Holloway said. "Classic early markers. I've seen it many times." "And the medication you prescribed for his blood pressure," Ben said, still perfectly calm. "Can you confirm the exact compound and dosage for the record?" Something in Dr. Holloway's posture shifted, subtle but real, the shift of a man realizing a question has more weight than its wording suggested. "I'd need to check his chart," he said. "That's all right," Ben said. "I have an independent lab report here I'd like you to look at instead." He slid Priya's toxicology report across the table. Dr. Holloway's face went the color of old paper. "That's not," he started. "That's a certified toxicology analysis of the medication taken from Edwin Marsh's own bottle in his own nightstand," Ben said, his voice never rising. "It identifies the substance not as the blood pressure medication your practice prescribed, but as clonazepam. Would you like to explain that discrepancy for the record, Dr. Holloway, given that you're the physician of record and the one who authored the cognitive assessment supporting a conservatorship petition based on symptoms that substance would directly produce?" Renee's hand, still resting over mine on the table, went rigid. "Curtis," Renee said sharply, "we should." "We should nothing," Curtis said, but his voice had lost the easy confidence it carried a moment earlier. "Dad, what is this?" "This," I said quietly, "is me finally understanding why my own grandson told his teacher I sleep in the garage." The room went entirely silent. Renee's face, which had held its warm, concerned expression through everything up to that point, finally cracked, just slightly, into something colder and more calculating, the expression underneath the performance. You told him that on purpose, I said, looking at her directly. You built a story for a 7-year-old to repeat, specific enough that a teacher, a mandated reporter, would flag it and generate exactly the kind of independent documentation you needed to support a guardianship filing. I heard you explain the entire strategy to Curtis, Renee. In this kitchen. 9 days after I supposedly left for Scranton. You were never in Scranton, Renee said slowly, understanding dawning across her face with visible speed. No, I said. I wasn't. I reached into my jacket pocket and set my phone on the table, screen up, a recorded audio file already queued. I pressed play. Renee's own voice filled the dining room, tinny through the small speaker but perfectly clear. Keep it exactly where it is. Too much too fast and it shows up in a blood panel if anyone ever orders the right test. Slow is safer. We have time. Holloway's not going anywhere, and neither is your father, not until we're ready. Curtis's face had gone completely white. He looked at his wife the way you look at someone you suddenly realize you never actually knew. Renee, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What did you do to my father? I did what needed doing, Renee said, and something in her tone, cold and final, told me she'd stop performing entirely. Do you know what it's like watching an old man sit on $400,000 and a house worth $700,000 more, doing nothing with it but grieving a dead wife? We were building a future for Toby, Curtis. Someone in this family needed to be practical. You used our son, Curtis said, his voice cracking. You had him lie to his teacher. He didn't lie, Renee said. He repeated what he was told, the way children do. That's not manipulation, Curtis, that's parenting toward an outcome. Dr. Holloway had gone very quiet, his eyes fixed on the toxicology report still sitting on the table between us, calculating, I imagine, exactly how much of this he was about to be dragged into. Denise, who had been sitting silently in her cardigan for the entire exchange, rose from her chair and, for the first time, revealed the small badge she'd kept clipped inside her jacket pocket the entire evening. Renee Marsh, she said, Curtis Marsh, Dr. Gerald Holloway. I need you all to stay exactly where you are. The front door opened before anyone at the table had time to react. Detective Cho entered first, followed by 2 uniformed officers who had been parked, patient and invisible, 2 houses down for the past 90 minutes. We have officers outside as well, Detective Cho said, her voice calm and utterly without theater. I'd like to speak with each of you individually, starting with Dr. Holloway, regarding your involvement in the medical documentation supporting at least 3 separate guardianship or conservatorship filings, including one connected to the death of Theodore Whitlock 14 months ago. Dr. Holloway's composure finally broke entirely. I want an attorney, he said, his voice thin. That's your right, Detective Cho said. You'll have that opportunity. Curtis sat frozen at his own dinner table, staring at his wife with an expression I recognized because I had worn something close to it myself, weeks earlier, standing behind a coat rack at Lyndale Elementary, the specific, disorienting grief of discovering that someone you trusted completely had been operating an entirely different set of intentions the whole time you thought you knew them. Curtis Marsh, Detective Cho continued, I need to ask you some questions as well. Given the recorded conversation in which you discussed medication dosage for your father with apparent knowledge of its effects. I didn't know what was actually in the bottles, Curtis said, his voice breaking. Renee handled that. I swear to God, I didn't know what she was actually giving him. That's something we'll need to establish through the investigation, Detective Cho said, not unkindly, but without softening the reality of it either. Renee was placed under arrest at 7:52 that evening, in the dining room where Margaret and I had hosted 30 years of holidays, her wrists cuffed in front of her while she stared at me with an expression that held no remorse, only the cold calculation of someone recalculating an equation that had suddenly failed. Dr. Holloway was arrested 12 minutes later, at his own vehicle in my driveway, still insisting he'd only done what any concerned physician might do. Curtis was not arrested that night. Detective Cho explained, gently, once the others had been taken, that his role would require further investigation, whether he had known the true nature of the substance in my medication, whether his statements on the recording constituted knowing participation in a fraud or merely reflected his trust in a wife he genuinely hadn't understood. I watched my son sit at that table long after everyone else had left, his head in his hands, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel that night, not triumph, not relief, but a grief for him nearly as sharp as my own. "Dad," he said finally, not lifting his head. "Did you know? This whole time, did you know it was going to end like this?" "I knew something was wrong," I said. "I didn't know it was this. I don't think I let myself imagine it was this." He looked up at me then, his eyes red, his voice barely holding together. "I should have asked more questions," he said. "About Holloway. About the medication. About all of it. I told myself I was just trusting my wife." "I know," I said. "And I did know, in the way you know a wound is real even before you've decided how angry you're allowed to be about it." The investigation that followed took for months to reach trial, and I won't walk through every hearing and filing, because the reference points that matter most are the ones that change something. Detective Cho's team confirmed, through Sal's earlier documentation and their own subsequent subpoenas, that Ridgeline Family Consulting had facilitated at least 4 guardianship arrangements over 3 years, all involving elderly clients whose adult relatives paid Dr. Holloway's practice for supporting medical assessments. Corinne Ashby, the woman in the Chambersburg care facility, agreed to testify. Theodore Whitlock's daughter agreed to testify as well, and though prosecutors ultimately couldn't establish sufficient evidence to charge anyone directly in connection with his death, the pattern was entered into the record as evidence of intent and method in my own case, which the judge later called, in her written ruling, a documented business model built on the exploitation of vulnerable elderly individuals through their own families. Renee was charged with conspiracy to commit elder abuse, administering a controlled substance without consent with intent to impair, fraud, and conspiracy to commit felony theft by deception related to the guardianship scheme. Dr. Holloway was charged with medical fraud, falsification of records, and conspiracy. Marcus Bell, Renee's brother and the operator of Ridgeline, was charged separately, in a case that ultimately connected to all 4 documented victims. Curtis was never charged criminally. The prosecution's review of the evidence concluded that while his statements on the recording showed troubling complicity in discussing dosage levels, there wasn't sufficient proof he'd known the specific substance being used was anything other than an adjustment to my legitimate prescription. I don't know, even now, whether I fully believe that distinction. I don't know if Curtis fully believes it either. What I know is that he cooperated completely with the investigation once it began, that he provided testimony that helped convict his own wife, and that in the 4 months between that dinner and Renee's trial, he moved out of my house, found an apartment 15 minutes away, and began the slow, uneven work of rebuilding something with Toby that didn't depend on me being sick or absent or controlled. The trial itself, when it finally came, took 11 days. I testified for most of 1 full day, walking the jury through the school hallway, the coat rack, the recording, the toxicology report, the folder of documents Ben and Sal had assembled with a patience I still don't fully understand how I found. Corinne Ashby testified by video link from her care facility, her voice thin but steady, describing a home she would likely never live in again. A financial forensics expert walked the jury through Ridgeline's fee structure and its precise correlation with cognitive assessment dates across 4 separate patients. Renee's defense attorney tried, in cross-examination, to suggest that I was a paranoid, grieving old man who'd manufactured a conspiracy out of ordinary family tension. "Mr. Marsh," he said, "isn't it true you installed hidden surveillance in your own home, hired a private investigator, and secretly tested your own medication, all based on a single comment made by a 7-year-old child?" "That's true," I said. "Doesn't that seem like an extreme response to a child's comment?" "It would have been," I said, "if the comment had been the whole story." It wasn't. It was the first loose thread. I spent 34 years finding out what happens when you pull on the loose thread instead of ignoring it. This is what was underneath it. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned guilty verdicts on every count against Renee, and guilty verdicts against Dr. Holloway on all but one of the charges related directly to my case. Marcus Bell was convicted in a separate trial 3 months later on charges connected to 2 of the other documented victims. Renee was sentenced to 17 years, with eligibility for parole after 12. Dr. Holloway received 9 years and the permanent revocation of his medical license. Marcus Bell received 14 years. At sentencing, the judge asked if I wanted to make a statement. I stood, my hands steady in a way I hadn't expected them to be. "I don't forgive what happened in my house," I said. "But I want the record to reflect something else, too. My grandson is 7 years old. He told his teacher a story he believed completely because the adults around him built it for their own purposes and never once considered what it would cost him to carry it. I am not interested in revenge for myself. I am interested in making sure nobody ever again treats a child's honesty as a tool in a scheme against his own family." I sat down. Curtis, sitting 2 rows behind me, was crying quietly. Toby wasn't in the courtroom that day. Curtis and I had agreed, together, for once, that he was too young for any of this, and would learn what he needed to know about it only when he was old enough to carry the weight properly. It's been 7 months now since the dinner in my own dining room ended with handcuffs instead of dessert. Curtis and I are rebuilding something slower and more honest than what we had before, which I've come to believe might actually be a healthier foundation than the one we lost. He brings Toby over every Wednesday, the same as I used to bring him to school pickup. We don't talk about Renee much. When we do, it's careful, factual, the way you discuss a storm that's already passed rather than one you're still bracing for. Toby doesn't talk about the garage anymore. He sleeps in his own room at his father's new apartment, and when he stays over at my house, he sleeps in the guest room down the hall from mine, the door open a crack the way Margaret always used to leave it for him, though he never knew that particular detail was hers before it was mine. I still see Dr. Holloway's replacement, a physician named Grace Whitfield who reviews every prescription against my full history twice before renewing it, unprompted, because that's simply how she practices medicine, and I've come to understand that most doctors do practice that way. I was simply unlucky, or perhaps targeted, enough to find one who didn't. I think often about the moment I stood behind that coat rack, 8 feet from my own grandson, hearing him describe a life I wasn't living. I think about how easy it would have been to let it go, to tell myself children say strange things, that Toby had gotten confused, that Renee's warmth at dinner that same night meant everything was fine. 40 years of checking numbers taught me not to do that, and I am more grateful for that habit now than I have been for almost anything else in my life. If you're listening to this and something small and strange has crossed your path recently, a comment that doesn't quite fit, a symptom 2 people predicted before you noticed it yourself, a story a child repeats too specifically to have invented it alone, I want to tell you plainly that loose thread is worth pulling. You are allowed to be wrong. Most of the time, thankfully, you will be. But the cost of checking is almost always smaller than the cost of not checking, and I would rather have spent a few $100s proving my family loved me exactly as much as I believed than spend even one more year not knowing they didn't. Family isn't only the people who share your name. Denise, who sat beside me at more low points than I can count. Sal, who found 2 other victims nobody else had connected. Ben, who built a case brick by brick with more patience than I deserved. Priya, who told me the truth in a small consultation room even though it would have been easier for everyone if she'd found nothing at all. They became, over those difficult months, as much a part of protecting my future as anyone bound to me by blood. And Toby is still learning to trust the adults around him, slowly, the way any child recovers from being used without understanding it. He's 8 now. He still likes chess, though he plays it better than I do these days, and he still has his grandmother's exact laugh, the one that starts as a hiccup and grows into something helpless. Some Wednesday evenings, watching him laugh that laugh across my own kitchen table, I'd genuinely like to hear it in the comments. Tell me what stood out, tell me what you would have done differently standing in that school hallway. If you know someone caring for an aging parent, or an aging parent who's noticed something small and strange in their own home, maybe share this with them. Awareness doesn't undo harm that's already been done, but it can stop the next version of it before it starts. And one last honest note, the same kind I try to offer at the start of every one of these. While this account reflects real and documented patterns in elder financial abuse and medical fraud, certain identifying details have been changed, and elements of the account have been shaped for the sake of clarity and privacy. If stories like this aren't for you, that's completely all right. Take care of yourself, and I hope you find something else more suited to what you need. But if you're still here, thank you for staying with me through all of it. It matters more than you probably know.